Hello, I'm Brian Devine. I'm glad I brought my wife today, so at least she's one person here who's older than I am. So today I'm going to give you grandfatherly advice. It started out as fatherly advice, but I aged out of that quickly as my children now have children. One thing, though, that has really struck me when speaking with young people these days is an impending sense of hopelessness. That this generation is somehow doomed, and the global changes we are facing are somehow too powerful. So hopefully you will allow an old dude to put this sometimes overwhelming feeling in some better context and embolden you to push back against it through the power of optimism, empathy, and persistence. Driven by a sense of fairness and equity, and always aiming at the common good. Every generation has faced problems that they all thought were difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. They and I somehow struggled through them to put our daunting problems the past few years in context. My grandparents had to deal with immigrating to the United States, finding homes, finding jobs, finding each other, and ultimately settling in Brooklyn, New York. And my grandfather was a fireman and a policeman, 20 years each, fought in the Army in World War I. Then they dealt with the Spanish flu pandemic, twice as deadly as our pandemic. And then my parents and my grandparents, they dealt with prohibition as well, when my grandmother made gin in the bathtub. But then my parents and grandparents had to deal with the Great Depression, followed by my father serving in World War II. Each of them did their best for their countries, for themselves, and their families during those times, as I did in my times. You, in turn, will have to face today's and tomorrow's problems, enriching your own life while helping others while you overcome them. Everyone has the power within them to affect positive change on a daily basis in ways both small and large, with positive mindset. You can do that with your family, your friends, your classmates, your teammates, your workmates, your church and organizational members, and even strangers by treating them with respect and dignity. Never blame others if things don't go your way, but instead work harder to show them that you deserve whatever you are seeking. Always remain optimistic and confident, because that will actually help you accomplish your goals. In my case, I remain obliviously optimistic, despite failures, tragedies, and near-death experiences. Sylvia, my wife of almost 60 years, my optimism and work ethic, God's good graces and luck helped me survive the above. I was blessed by living in America's greatest times in many ways, but also times of horrendous injustice, which was intolerable. My first steps included working on John Kennedy's 1960 campaign and joining the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in the Public Health Service upon graduation in 1963 to help make the world a better place for all. Many of my friends joined the Peace Corps, Vista, the Teachers Corps, or worked for the federal government. It was a heady time for people working for positive change in the US, as President Kennedy gave us hope and optimism. The 60s also was a decade with the most turmoil. Legal segregation existed during my school years. They didn't desegregate Washington, D.C. schools until I was in the 8th grade, Virginia schools until I was in the 12th grade, and Montgomery County, Maryland schools where I lived until I was a junior in college. And in the state of Virginia, interracial marriage was not legal until I was 25 years old. So in my case, I decided to fight unfairness wherever I found it. That has been my lifetime goal that continues. Poverty and racial and gender inequality were the first issues that I focused on. When my black classmates crossed the bridge at the bottom of the Georgetown campus to Virginia, they couldn't go to the Hot Shots restaurant there, couldn't stay at the Marriott Hotel, couldn't drink out of the drinking fountain, couldn't use the bathroom, but they could go in the back door, wash dishes, but not interact with customers. This unfairness energized me, and I got involved in the civil rights movement to fight against racial inequality. To show how ridiculous the world was, on June 13, 1964, Sylvia and I were going to be married in St. Michael's Catholic Church in Silver Spring, Maryland. The priest who was to marry us noticed that Sylvia's best friend and college classmate and her maid of honor was black. He then said he would not marry us. So it took me 20 minutes to convince him to allow us to be married. Once Sylvia and her grandfather went down the aisle with the photographer taking pictures, the priest left the altar and chased the photographer out of the church. Later, when we're kneeling on the altar doing our I do's, the photographer tries to sneak back in to take a picture. He leaves the altar a second time. And I think there's 2 photos that we actually had in the entire live, and then this photo is the only one that Sylvia and myself taken after the event. Anyway, nonviolent protesting actually had brought the civil rights movement to the forefront. But the real heroes were students integrating schools, sitting in at lunch counters, helping to register black voters, and the thousands who were brutally beaten, jailed, and sometimes killed while trying to change the world. I was a nonviolent Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. follower, and Martin and President Kennedy were the most impactful people in my lifetime. Unfortunately, it was also a time of violence against black leaders and white leaders who supported them. The assassinated included all sexes, races, and age groups of clergy, lawyers, students, organizers, President John Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, leaders like Black Muslims Malcolm X, Southern Christian Leadership Conference Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the Black Panthers Fred Hampton. Their deaths left a great hole in black leadership, slowing the movement and cheated the world out of the positive changes the black leaders, as well as their white allies, would have accomplished. Things are better than it was then, but not nearly as good as it would have been. I believe Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were civil rights' most brilliant leaders and greatest orators, who together ultimately helped pass the civil rights bills. Dr. Martin Luther King's March on Jobs and Freedom in 1963 was the most uplifting event I have ever been part of. I was made a monitor of the march, and they'd taken 3 hours of training to ensure that the march was peaceful. More than 250,000 people marched to the foot of the Lincoln Memorial. And this was my view during the I Have a Dream speech. And wow, what a view. That march, as well as President Kennedy's assassination, helped Lyndon Johnson pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Act, and the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which was passed 1 week after Martin's assassination. Martin's death devastated me, but again, re-energized my need to drive positive change. In the mid-60s, I was asked to become president of the Federal Employees of the Democratic Society, the Feds, a government-wide organization of activists working for the federal government, trying to facilitate positive change from within. Later, activists suggested that I run for president of the Americans for Federation of Government Employees, the AFG union, and I won. Both Feds and the AFG union created positive changes to solve economic and racial equality in the federal government. My wife and I lived on 30 cents a day, 10 cents per meal, for a month in solidarity with fellow mothers, which was extraordinarily difficult. During that time, I was talking to Ted Kennedy's staff on supporting a bill to increase that amount. Teddy was planning on Monday morning to support the bill, but history got in the way and his car tragically went off the bridge in Chappaquiddick, and therefore no press conference or no bill passed. My work-related and personal travels, I encountered extreme poverty in the 1960s in many parts of the country, including the South, Appalachia, and the inner city's Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. My last 3 years in Washington, I worked on policy to fight hunger in the U.S. a major issue at that time. I'll just hold it. To put it in context, in 1967, Senator Robert Kennedy held the Hunger USA Conference, and President Lyndon Johnson had his Pockets of Poverty proposal. Every bureau within the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare were to develop programs to help solve the hunger crisis in the U.S. I was statistical advisor for planning for the National Health Survey, responsible for planning what the department should do next. I proposed creating an ongoing, much improved federal health program, the National Nutritional Surveillance System, to continuously monitor the health of all people in the U.S. and to allocate federal funds based on current program success rates, and that was not being done at that time. I preferred starting with the school-age children and later adding the rest of the population. My proposal was to give poor school children breakfast, lunch, and food to take home for dinner after school. That way their bodies and their minds would grow to their full potential. President Nixon called on the 1969 White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health to put an end in hunger in the United States for all time and improve the nutritional well-being of all Americans. The landmark conference led eventually to doubling funding for food for children of welfare mothers and school children. It also said to make permanent my proposed National Nutrition Surveillance System, which now has survived over 50 years and since 1990 is called the National Health and Nutritional Examination Survey. Sometimes, though, you need to put yourself at risk and do the right thing despite negative consequences. My bureau, despite agreeing that the National Nutrition Surveillance System was needed, actually turned down my proposal because the senior statistical advisor in planning said our appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate were run by Southerners and they would cut our appropriation. So undeterred, I gave my turn down plan to a friend who was an assistant secretary of HEW who passed it along to the secretary of HEW. 2 weeks later, the secretary, Bob Finch, former lieutenant governor of California, told them that they were to implement my plan. And I helped work the proposal through Congress and the Bureau of the Budget. I did not know the full impact of what I did until 16 years after I left the federal government, when I was invited to speak at my boss, Dr. Arnold Engel's retirement party. Sylvia and I flew to Washington, D.C. and took the metro to a hotel in Silver Spring, Maryland. When entering the ballroom, hundreds of people gave me a standing ovation. It was surreal because I had no idea even while I was there. I then learned that Dr. Engel had regaled them with Brian's stories, and everyone there now worked to accomplish my proposal, showing that doing the right thing at the right time can have a lasting help to drive positive change and fight inequality. All I helped accomplish in the 1960s occurred during my daily activities, attending college, doing my job, and working in organizations for change, something all of you can also try to do. 1 week after the Bureau of the Budget released the funds for the National Nutrition Surveillance System in 1970, Charles Lazarus of Toys R Us offered me a job to open the third market in Northern California, and I accepted. I became a retailer, left the Public Health Service, so instead of working 40 hours a week on my job and 40 hours a week trying to change the world, I could work 80 hours a week in retail and try to do the same thing. Toys R Us, as Petco later, were ethical retailers, allowing me to implement policies, creating management opportunities for women, minority, sexual preferences, etc., largely non-existent then. Newspapers then ran men's and women's jobs. Sylvia, when she first graduated college, had to take a secretarial job and would be turned down when she asked for supervisory jobs. So I was also an undercover boss, and I actually saw that women obviously were as good as men in the stores. And I suggested Charles Lazarus to have 2 managers in each store, one an operations manager to hire, train, and deal with customers, and the other store merchandise manager who would actually go to the store and in the store. Thereby, in a very short time, doubling the number of women managers in Toys R Us. I was going to shift it. Okay, I'll just keep going. Toys R Us set up children's playrooms in hospitals across the country, created safe protocols for toys, forced manufacturers to put age and instructions on toys, and treated their employees fairly, giving profit sharing and stock options during my 16 years. Petco in 1990 was turned into a safe place after I arrived, with diverse employees, including a high percentage of women, minority, and LGBTQ associates. Petco gave stock options as well as IRA contributions to all employees during my 26 years. The Petco Foundation, now Petco Love, founded almost 25 years ago, has invested over $300 million to over 4,000 animal welfare partners and helped 6.5 million animals to be adopted. The quote attributed to Gandhi, "The civilization is measured by how it treats the weakest members," addresses what I helped to create in my retail career, enhancing kids' and animals' lives, and thereby everyone's lives. Personally, Sylvia and I support education and created the Devine Scholar Program for talented underprivileged kids at St. Anselm's, Abbey School, grades 6 to 12 in Northeast Washington, D.C., a 43% minority, and ranked 17th toughest high school in the U.S. My brother and I got scholarships there and created our success to the school, which prepared us for life. Every Devine scholar has won a full scholarship to major universities, positively changing one life at a time. The first 30 years of our life were a struggle, so remain optimistic despite current circumstances, because your life will change for the better if you strive. Our last 40 years, we've had success and have attempted to give back to help others so they can have a better chance for their own success and happiness. Everyone, every day, has the ability to change the world positively. You may never or much later find out these positive outcomes, as occurred in my life. Helping others can give you much more satisfaction than helping yourself. So my hope is that everyone hearing this will fight your generation's battles your entire life as I did. So do the right thing and speak out against injustice and don't silently accept it. Thank you.